But you think of it, we're all trauma survivors. Everybody who's grown up, we're all damaged goods. So when you get in a room full of people woodworking, whatever their backgrounds are, everybody is suddenly on vacation from their damaged heads.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crazy Good Turns, the podcast that recognizes and celebrates people who do amazing things for others. I'm your host, Frank Blake, and today I'm thrilled to bring you a conversation with Tom Bodett. I suspect you recognize Tom by name, but I'm sure you will recognize his voice. For nearly 40 years, Tom has been the voice of Motel 6's TV and radio commercials, wrapping up each spot with his famous tagline, "We'll leave the light on for you." But Tom is much more than a great baritone coming through your screen. He's lived a fascinating life, and he's a terrific storyteller. Tom worked as a carpenter and home builder in Alaska, and along the way, and almost by accident, he became a radio personality and writer. Today, you can find Tom outside of Brattleboro, Vermont, where he's launched something that I think is a wonderful and interesting crazy good turn of its own. It's called HatchSpace. HatchSpace is a woodworking school and workshop. More importantly, HatchSpace is a place where people from throughout the community come together to create and build things with their hands. And as you'll hear in today's show, making things can have a life-changing or even life-saving impact. Certainly it did for Tom. He credits woodworking with helping him to get and stay sober for more than 30 years. He'll talk about those changes and others that he's seen firsthand since launching HatchSpace in 2018. Along the way, we'll get into some of his views on the importance of making things and how that's a critical element in our human existence. I think this is a fascinating interview. For the first half, we'll talk about Tom's journey from Michigan to Alaska to TVs and radios nationwide. In the second half, we'll focus on HatchSpace and Tom's thoughts on life and meaning today. And then we'll end with Tom's story about a person who's done a crazy good turn for him. Really an amazing and powerful story. And I think what you're going to hear in our discussion today is the underlying reason why his short tagline has been so successful and lasted so long is that Tom just radiates an authentic concern for others. It comes in his voice, it comes in his stories, it comes in his whole approach to life. I think you're really going to like this discussion of crazy good turns. So let's get right to it. Here's our conversation with Tom. Tom, this is just a real pleasure and privilege to have you on Crazy Good Turns podcast. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for having me, Frank. I love what you're doing with this.
So as our listeners are going to learn over the course of the conversation with you, you've had a fascinating and varied life, done lots of different things, and yet what everybody's going to know about you are 7 words. We'll leave the light on for you.
Yeah.
How does that feel? With all the things you've done, you kind of know this is, as it were, on your tombstone.
I know. In fact, I've told my family if that ends up on my tombstone, I will come back to haunt them in horrible ways. It is, I struggle with it, I'll be honest, Frank, for a while because when my writing and radio career kind of took off in the mid-'80s through NPR, I was really happy with that. It was very exciting. And Motel 6 came into the picture about 2 years into that. And it was a little awkward at first, honestly, because the commercial stuff with NPR, but I knew where my bread was going to get buttered. And so I found a happy balance there. But as I published 7 books and untold audio programs and radio programs, written and recorded hundreds of thousands of words. And I only needed 7, as it turns out.
Give our listeners a sense of how that came about. What's the story behind the tagline and what's now? I mean, it's got to be one of the longest running ad campaigns in history.
I think it now is. There was Lipton Tea's, Arthur Godfrey's Lipton Tea campaign was the longest running campaign in American advertising for a while. And we surpassed it, I think, we're in year 37 now, something like that. So I think it's true. I think that it is the longest running campaign in America, which is amazing for something that I literally did for the money once, almost 40 years ago, and how it turned into a really unusual relationship between talent, as they call us, and the client, which is Motel 6, and the advertising agency, which was the Richards Group for many, many years, and more recently moved to Barclay out of Kansas City. And that sort of three-legged stool has always been stable, and that is as coming from business as you do. You know how unusual that is.
How did the tagline come about?
Well, the way that worked is I got a call from a guy at the Richards Group. A guy named David Fowler gave me a call, and he went on to be the global creative director of Ogilvy Mather out of New York. A brilliant guy, really funny, born and raised in Waco, Texas. And so he called me out of the blue when I was about 2 years into my NPR stint. He said, "I've been hearing you on the radio, and I think you'd be a great voice for this new campaign we got for this company called Motel 6. Have you ever heard of them?" And I said, "Yeah, I have." And why me for that? And he says, "Well, you sound like the kind of guy who stays there." And which, was true. And I've actually was the kind of guy who stays there, except I was living in Alaska and never had much call to. The thing I was doing on NPR were these little Life in Alaska, slice of life things, once or twice a week on All Things Considered. And, and it was like basically working man raising a family kind of stuff. So I got why that might be his reason. So I asked, though, I said, what does something like that pay? And he told me, and I said, okay. How do we do it? Because it was just going to be a trial, right? I mean, they were just going to test this. So he flew me down to San Francisco, first class, which I'd never seen before. He came up from Texas, and we went into a recording studio there. I'd never been in a commercial recording studio. And he had a pile of scripts, and we're going through them, and there were about 3 or 4 other people in suits in the room lingering around, the account people and all of that. And it was making me terribly nervous. And the engineer, a guy named Bob Lindner, who's since passed away, and he ended up being my engineer for over 20 years, nicest guy. He came into the booth at one point to adjust my microphone. And I said, "Bob, all those people milling around out making me nervous. Would it be weird if I asked them to leave?" And he said, "Hey, you're the talent. You're supposed to be weird." And so he carried the message out there. They all left, and Frank, they never came back. To this day, when we go into booth, it's me and the producer director, nobody else. And I think that's part of why the campaign has endured, because we've been able to keep it clear, keep it simple, keep the heart of it without a lot of rotating opinion. Because, the executives in advertising, I mean, I think they're all on 6-week contracts. They tend to roll through pretty frequently. So in any case, we're going through these things. I'm getting relaxed. We're going through, and they didn't have a closing line yet. It was just, and this is, Tom Bodett for Motel 6. And it was like, and that was part of the joke, because nobody knew who in the hell Tom Bodett was. And that was part of the fun of it. We recognized that they weren't ending, they just kind of stopped. It's just like it needed some. So we're thinking about things we could do, so see you down the road, take care, We'll leave the key under the potted plant. And I said, I got an idea. Just roll it. I don't even want to talk about it. Let's just roll it. And we rolled another spot, and it got to the end. I says, I'm Tom Bodett from Motel 6, and we'll leave the light on for you. And everybody in the room was kind of like, they were like, oh, yeah, that might work. It wasn't like choirs of angels saying, "Ah, you're there." It was natural for me because it's something that, your parents would say when you're coming home from somewhere, "Oh, I'm going to be in late, Mom. It's okay. We'll leave the light on for you." And it just seemed like a natural thing to say. It wasn't something I invented so much as I just pulled it out of my own experience.
I promise this is the last question I'll ask about the commercial, and we'll get into the more relevant things. But why do you think it has connected so well to listeners? What does it mean to you? What do you think it means to the listeners?
Well, I think why it connects. Number one, I am a terrible actor. I've done a little bit of animation work, but I don't get invited back very much because I've got like one guy I do, And so when I'm asked to do something that I'm not feeling, I suck at it. And I've never had training or anything. I know you can learn that stuff. I've just never bothered. So I think part of it is I am exactly what you think I am when you hear me. We've been very careful, and we've had to fight for it over the years as things change, that I keep myself on the same side of the counter as the people listening. Like, it's not that I'm the owner of Motel 6 saying, you should come stay with us because we're what this. It's like, Motel 6 is great, and here, let me tell you why. And it's kind of like I'm speaking to them, face to face.
Right.
Do what you want, but this is a pretty good deal. That's kind of that sort of thing, the way people talk to each other in life. And we never oversell it.
Right. As a storyteller, I mean, you're just a phenomenal storyteller. Are there things that guide your approach to telling stories?
A lot of them are unconscious, Frank, to tell you the truth. I play by ear, if you will. I also play guitar something over the years. I can't read music. It's just, and that's sort of how I've approached this. I take, like the 5-paragraph essay is like a classic, writing form that every high school kid is taught. I learned what a 5-paragraph essay was after a textbook used one of my pieces from one of my early books as an example of the 5-paragraph essay, and somebody showed it to me. Yeah, I said, I'll be damned. That's
that's terrific.
But those are the we all recognize it when we see it because we're steeped in it, right? And so I think if I had a secret at all, or talent, if you will, is I'm able to absorb what I enjoy and absorb what speaks to me, if you will, and reproduce it. There's no real talent here other than I am a great mirror to the ordinary American personality. That's the way I think of myself. I'm the generic American.
Not entirely generic. You've had some amazing experiences. How long were you in Alaska?
23 years.
Wow. Maybe just take to a little bit what those 23 years were like. I know that's asking a lot to be compressed.
Right. I dropped out of Michigan State University after not even 2 years. I wanted to be a writer, and I wasn't very good at it. You never are at that age. And I couldn't stand Michigan. I grew up in southern Michigan, this little farming factory town called Sturgis, right on the Indiana border. Went to Michigan State, which is like 80 miles away. I just was dying to get out of there. And college wasn't interesting enough to me to keep me. And I was seeing all this stuff. The West was like in all the news, not just this was the early 70s. So, it's like all of the back to the land people were, the communes and all that sort of nouveau mountain man stuff was going on. The pipeline in Alaska was in the news. That was under construction. And I just couldn't stand it anymore. And I just dropped out of school unceremoniously from about 5 days after I had the idea to. And I sold my my beat up car, my guitars, and I sold everything. And I got a backpack, and I headed west with about $200 in my pocket, which was not no money in 1975. And headed out there. I stopped in Oregon, worked for a while, ended up in the hospital. Another story I won't waste time with here. Got over that. And a year later, I went to Alaska, still chasing this idea of just doing my Jack London, Jack Kerouac thing. I just going to go work on a logging camp. I'm going to work on a fishing boat and an oil rig. And I did all that. And my first 2 years in Alaska, where I was basically that guy, really, really enjoying it. 21 years old. It's the Wild West. So there was so much work, so many people coming in. And one of the jobs I had was working on a construction crew building a cannery warehouse. And I had a talent for carpentry because I grew up helping my dad, who was a do-it-yourselfer, fix up our wreck of a house in Sturgis, Michigan, my entire childhood. So it was easy for me to walk onto a construction job and bluff my way into whatever we were doing. And then because of the times and the need for people willing to work, when I was 23 years old, I'd been in Alaska 2 years. I built 13 houses. I became an independent contractor for about 10 years, and I built a lot of houses, a lot of stuff, and did pretty well at it. Got married, had a kid, living a pretty good middle-class life, I'd say. My wife was a school teacher. Then one day, a friend of mine who worked at the local community public radio station, which I had built, by the way, as a contractor. He said, "Hey, I enjoy hanging out with you. I've listened to you carry on at the bar," which I used to do a lot. We're looking for local people just to do some commentary on the weekly, once a week on the news, just to add some life to the broadcast. Would you be interested in doing it? And I said, "Oh, well, I don't know, maybe that's interesting, but what would I write about?" He says, "Whatever you're doing. What are you doing today?" I said, I gotta take my dog in to have him fixed." He says, "Write about that." And so I did. So the very first thing I put on the radio was having my poor boneheaded black Labrador neutered. And then, and then it went from there. The next thing is I had quit smoking. So I wrote a whole thing about that and the stupid things you go through to do that. And then I went on a commercial halibut trip with a friend for a weekend outing. And so I wrote about that. And it just became kind of a fun weekly habit that I had no plans for other than just enjoying it. These things made their way up through the Alaska network, and they were going statewide, which made me think my career had peaked, and I was like as happy as I could be because my whole life that was my universe. Alaska was my universe. So if you were on Alaska News Nightly, I was like, that was the Oprah Winfrey of Alaska, right? Then they made their way from there to NPR. Corey Flintoff, who went to NPR himself years later, sent them down, and they put a piece that I'd written about that game, Trivial Pursuit, which had just come out. And I remember I was standing on the roof of a house that was being converted into offices right downtown in Homer. We were roofing it, and this car roars up in the driveway, and this woman who was their operations director said, "Tom, Ted Clark is on the phone from All Things Considered, and they want to use one of your pieces, and you need to call him and talk to him." And I thought, wow. And I think my hammer is still laying on that roof.
That's great.
And I knocked off early that night because All Things Considered came on at like 2:30 in the afternoon there or something because of Alaska time. And I went with three of my buddies, and we're listening to All Things because you don't know when it's going to come on. And I heard Susan Stamberg introduce me, and I swear I almost fainted. I mean, that was
such a big deal.
Oh, it was. And from there, the world kind of beat a path to my door. I started getting, from the time my first commentary went on the air, Frank, this is not a story to tell struggling young writers, to when I had a book contract from a Boston publisher and an advance that would get me through the winter was 6 months.
Wow. That's extraordinary.
Isn't that something?
An accidental career almost.
It really kind of was, and I think part of the reason that it's been as successful as it has been is I never really expected it. I never expected it to grow at any step. Every time something new would happen, I thought, this is great. This is as good as it gets. And so there was something about having that contentment with what I was doing that actually helped. Because I think if you try too hard, you often alienate as many opportunities as you attract.
And so, in itself, we could spend a long time talking about that experience. What though triggered your moving to Vermont? Because as we speak now, you're in Vermont. You've been there for more than 20 years, right?
In fact, it's be 21 years this year. So pretty soon this will be the longest place I've ever lived. So. I love Vermont. It surprised me that we're here. I never thought I would leave Alaska. I had lived there my entire adult life. I got married there. I had a child there. I got divorced there. I got married again there. As the Neil Young song goes, all of my changes were there. I developed a magnificent drinking problem there, and I got sober there. It was Alaska just felt like that was my place. I knew it from the moment I set foot there. This was my land. And what changed was my first wife and I had a very amicable divorce, and we were committed to never letting our difficulties affect our boy. She met someone after a few years, and which called her out of state, and she moved down to the Seattle area, where I was all upset one day, and she said, why don't we just move down there and see Courtney through high school? We can come back. And it's just like, that was so reasonable. Of course, I'd never thought of it. So that was that kind of broke the surface tension of leaving, if you will, because it was so we kept our house there. We moved down and lived there for 4 years. Outside of Seattle, a little town called Gig Harbor, which was fine and wonderful. And our boy went to school at a really nice private school that he wouldn't have had that opportunity had we stayed in Alaska. So there was a lot of good things. And just about the time that he was going to be graduating his senior year, and we're planning our move back to Alaska, Rita became pregnant with our now 21-year-old child. And Rita's family is as close as a family could be. Once she became pregnant, it was like, there's no way I'm raising the first grandchild in my family 5,000 miles from Nana and Papa. So what are we going to do? And I knew Vermont. I had a good friend here, and I'd visited him over the years. And I'd happened at that time to be out here on a college tour with my son. And we stopped and saw Will. And I'm looking around here, and I'm thinking, this isn't so bad. It's kind of like Alaska.
Yeah, exactly.
With roads. I mean, Alaska, and you can drive to Fenway Park in 2.5 hours. That's kind of interesting. So I mentioned it to Rita. She came out, and we looked around, and the place was just wired for kids. And this was it had it all. My kids were raised on a 50-acre hayfield and woods in the middle of a Vermont countryside. They've probably been to the Natural History Museum as often as people who live in New Jersey, in New York, and we've gone to Fenway Park. I can't tell you how many opening days we've gone there. But another big part of it was getting back to my sobriety. When I stopped drinking 33 years ago, I took up woodworking in my home shop. I hadn't done very much of it since I'd hung up my nail bag. It just called to me. I had a table saw. I had a few of the odds and end tools. I was still, fixing stuff up around the house. I still enjoyed doing that. But I'd never really spent a lot of time doing fine woodworking, furniture making, which had always interested me. And I always admired it, but I'd not spent the time to try to learn it. And I started doing that. And I found myself absorbed in it. I found that I was pretty good at it, and I kept getting better, kept challenging myself and learning new things. I became entirely enchanted by my woodworking thing. It became my new drug, no doubt about it. Just about the time we were moving to Vermont, I got my first piece in Fine Woodworking magazine, which was the equivalent of like getting a story in the New Yorker for a writer, which I've never had. And what cemented Vermont for me on like the first week is I walked into our local hardware store, which is still there, Brown and Roberts, best sold store in New England. Got the creaky wooden floor and the old wooden drawers with all the screws and bolts, and you know the place. And I walk in there and I introduced myself and I said, I'm fixing up a house. I'm building a barn out in Dummerston, and I'm also a woodworker. I'd like to have an account here if that's possible. And they said, sure, no problem. And what's your name? Told him Tom Bodett. And he goes, that's familiar. And I thought, okay, well, here it comes. It's going to be, And he said, didn't you just have a piece in Fine Woodworking?
That's great.
And I just like, okay, we're moving.
So, Tom, you've described woodworking. It's obviously a profound connection to you, but you've described it as the antidote to an ugly world.
Yes.
Can you explain that and how it connects with you?
Yeah. What I came to realize through my now 30-some years of being serious about my woodworking is that it's the one thing I've ever done that I totally can disappear into, where time can stop and I'll forget to eat. That never happened to me with my writing, with music. Sometimes with storytelling, it does. Anyone who's had to try to keep me to a time frame on stage knows that time does not move for me on stage. And those two things are related to me. Like storytelling and making things are the two primary human qualities. That's what sets us apart from the beasts in the woods. And there's a social philosopher named Richard Sennett who writes extensively about craft and the place it has served in human society from time immemorial. And he used the term homo faber, which is man as maker, that's who we are, and that we were that before we were telling stories, because we developed the cranial capacity and the manual dexterity to make and use complicated tools before we developed the musculature and things in our necks and the vocal cords to make the complicated languages that we use to express our big brains. And so what his premise is that we are makers first and foremost, and that when we are making something, we are fully human. And when I read that, which was only like 5 or 10 years ago, I totally recognized it as, yes, that's what it is. That's what it is. I am a maker. And it was that was when I started, when people ask me, like you're sitting next to somebody in an airport or something, they ask, what do you do? I stopped saying, I'm in publishing or broadcasting, to just saying, I'm a woodworker. And it felt so good to say that, to realize that, because it was hard for me I wanted to give up writing, but I also got a lot of my attention and my status, if you will, from my writing and radio work, but it wasn't doing it for me. I wasn't getting that sustenance that I wanted from it. It was a good job, but it wasn't a dream job anymore. It felt like something had changed in me.
So what led you to the crazy good turn of setting up your HatchSpace, which is, it's a workshop and a school, and it's much more, but what prompted you to do that? Because you could stay within your world of woodworking and, as you say, disappear into that without broadening it into the community.
Yes, and the reason I'm doing it is when I moved out to Vermont, one of the things that I recognized I'd never done is service work in my community. And when I moved out here to Vermont, I said, this is a chance for a fresh start. And so I ran for our local select board, which is like the town council, within a year and a half of being here. And that sort of started this habit of public service. So fast forward then 10, 15 years, I read this Richard Sennett book. I recognize what this woodworking has done for me. I recognized that I probably owed my sobriety to it, and I owed my woodworking to my sobriety. I met a guy, Greg Goodman, a local cabinet maker, who I didn't know previously. So anyway, we're talking about all this, and he had read Richard Sennett, and we started having this series of lunches where we were talking about craft, the importance of it, what the lack of it in our world means, and like how our digital life has taken us away from a connection to getting our hands on things, and how fortunate we were as woodworkers to have that place. And recognizing arrogantly, I think, a vacuousness in society and in so many of the people we knew, and kind of a helplessness in the material world. Can't fix a light socket, can't do these things.
Right.
Because I was in, community service mode by then, I said, what we ought to do is we ought to just open a wood shop, like just a community workshop where people can come in and learn this stuff, teach each other. It's kind of like a place to do this. Just like let other people experience this, and let the people who are already doing it get some decent machines and a decent place to work. So we went about that. It took us about a year and a half to find a place, figure it all out, organize it. We opened the doors thinking we were just going to be that, like a clubhouse for people who wanted to work with wood. And almost immediately, people came in, they wanted classes. Oh, do you teach woodworking? Well, yes and no. It's just like Greg's here all the time. I'm here as often as I can. We can show you some things, but classes, no, we're not set up to do that. But this demand kept coming, and more people kept coming in, and it wasn't safe anymore, right? Because there's a lot of people who don't know what they're doing, learning from people who barely know what they're doing. And so we started doing classes. And the first class that we set up was a woman, another retired cabinet maker, she's like my age, and she had always taught women woodworking on the side as she could, because she recognized, being the only woman on most of the jobs she ever worked on, that she wanted to make that change. We did a class called Introduction to Woodworking for Women. It sold out immediately. It was just women in the class, so that they didn't feel intimidated, because women weren't given the opportunity and the access to the shops that men were as they went up through school. That class now, Frank, has been running for the 5 years we've been open. Gail has moved on. We have 2 more teachers teaching it, and it's one right after another. It was like we opened a floodgate, and that there was an appetite there that nobody knew about. And so I thought we were going to certainly struggle with being a bunch of old white guys in this shop, and that has never been the case. It's always been at least an even mix between men and women. That has been really gratifying. What that taught us is there's a lot of people who have been traditionally overlooked by the trades, women among them. The building trades are predominantly, almost entirely men, predominantly white men, and increasingly old white men. And they started pulling shop classes out of middle schools like 20, 25 years ago. They pulled them out of high schools as well, and they put them over on a side track, career centers or trade schools. And it used to be that everybody got introduced to this. And now it's only people who, kids who are kind of being tracked. And there's a loss of dignity that comes with that. If you get, and kids smell, judgment when it's there. And if they smell that what they're hearing is, you're really not college material, why don't you go take a look at the career center? They know what that means, that they're being told that they're less than somebody else. And all of us who have been in the trades and worked with people in the trades know that it isn't full of dummies. There's a lot of really talented, very smart, ambitious people who live very good middle-class lifestyles and more working in the trades. It just isn't seen of as that way. You are now, because suddenly everyone realized kind of all at once.
What do you need, right?
Yeah. That since COVID, if you've tried to hire a plumber or electrician or something, you realize there just isn't enough of them. We missed an entire generation of people who might have chosen the trades as an alternative to college or other pursuits and didn't.
Why do you think woodworking is so effective at building a community? Because my observation is that it is.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, none of them based on very much other than observation. One of the things that there's a body of data building on is that woodworking is particularly effective. Woodworking therapy as a form of art therapy is particularly effective at treating trauma survivors and addiction recovery. And when I read that, I thought, again, I related it to my own sobriety. I didn't start woodworking because it was good for my sobriety, but it just was good for my sobriety. And I never kind of connected the two until I started reading some of this. In fact, there's a treatment center out in Colorado that I have to visit that their whole residency program is a woodworking program. And what I think it is, and what some of this data shows, is that all art therapy is good for us to get out of our heads and start doing something with our hands. But woodworking in particular, it's very sort of Euclidean. There's a lot of like simple geometry. Like you look at one side of the board, but you got to be able to picture the other side and all of this. So it's kind of very simple, basic shapes moving around in your head. And all of that happens in the frontal lobe where all your executive function is. And that's the part of the brain that gets impacted by trauma and addiction. It gets damaged, literally. Resources are taken from there and put in other areas of the brain that are being overstimulated by these stresses. And you have to rebuild that. And that's why sobriety is so hard to achieve, because it's one of the hardest things in the world a human being can do. And they're doing it with basically half their brain tied behind their back because their executive function just isn't working right. And so keeping appointments, showing up for your job, paying your car insurance, all of those kinds of routine executive function stuff that we take for granted just isn't working well. And woodworking therapy, if you will, somehow accelerates the healing. That's what there's more and more data building on that. And so what I think is like, okay, that's great for trauma survivors, the people in addiction. But you think of it, we're all trauma survivors. Everybody who's grown up, we're all damaged goods. So when you get in a room full of people woodworking, whatever their backgrounds are, everybody is suddenly on vacation from their damaged heads. And it's easy to talk to people when you're in that place. Because, oh, wow, that's an interesting way of doing it. I wouldn't have thought of that, there's all of these conversations that are neutral ground. I think of HatchSpace. We now have 150 active members, and we have classes going continually, and it's an issue-free zone. I've never once heard an argument, political discussion, anything like that going on. And people who I know would never meet in nature are there standing on either side of a table, one helping the other get a glue up going, and chatting away. It's that's why I have doubled and tripled down on this project, because I see what it's done for my community. We located it purposefully right downtown Brattleboro in a 38,000 square foot building that we occupy about a third of now. And the rest of it has got a print shop, a photography studio. It's like a lot of other maker organizations. And the energy that building has brought to itself. It was essentially an empty building after COVID. I bought it during COVID. And it's now completely full with a waiting list. And it's like a jewel of downtown Brattleboro. Everybody I see says, oh man, I can't believe what you've done with HatchSpace, because it's like every time I go by that thing, there's something happening there.
That's so brilliant.
And so when you think about it, Frank, what ails us in our politics, in our social worries, is we've forgotten how to get together and do things together. The old organizations, the Elks Club and the Moose Club and the bowling leagues and all of these things have really diminished from the parts they played in our communities a generation ago. And we didn't replace them with anything. And I think that's a large part of why rural communities like Brattleboro and across the country have suffered so much. Not only were they left out of the economic growth that the global economy brought, most of their jobs, including the town that I grew up in, were some of the first to go overseas. And nothing came in to replace them that gave people the dignity and the respect and the ability to take care of their families that they had before. And so having a center like this, which kind of can do all of that stuff, is really exciting to me. And we now have a lot of interest from other communities in what we're doing here and how they can do it in their towns. And this is what's getting me out of bed every day now, when, like you say, I could have just stayed in my wood shop and been enjoying myself. But now I feel like with what we've built and with the interest we have in this, that I can be a part of the solution of what happens next in our world here. It's not going to cure everything, but it's going to cure something. However you feel about the recent turn in things, nobody feels comfortable, right? And so this is I want to create more comfort in the world. And when I see it on the faces of the women and the kids, that when they've built something and they hold it up to have their picture taken with it, I just think this is it. This is what I was supposed to be doing all along.
Well, I think it is profound and important. I know I reflect on my Home Depot experience. You want to spend a few minutes on a Saturday morning that will make you feel good about life. Go into a Home Depot and see the kids' workshops with the kids lined up and with the goggles on, hammering away at something. It is a sight. I have a last question for you. Ask all of our guests. So this is a crazy good turn that you've done. Who's done a crazy good turn for you in your long and varied life?
Oh, gosh, there's so many. I've been a very lucky man. This is pretty personal, but I always go back to it because I've had turning points in my life, but not very many complete left turns. And I will give it to my father, who, he was not a gifted father. He grew up without one. He had no idea what he's doing. He had 6 kids, no time for any of us. I spent more time with him than most of the kids because I worked with him on the weekends. If you wanted to have time with my dad, he wasn't going to play with you, but he would work with you. And so I would show up to be the other end of his tape or drag the wire into the crawl space or whatever it was he needed. So when I said earlier that when I first went out west, I was hurt and ended up in a hospital, and I was almost killed in an electrical accident on a power pole that almost blew my right arm off my body, and I nearly lost the arm, nearly lost my life. I was in a hospital for a long time. My parents came out to visit me for a while. I refused to go home with them. My dad and I were not even really on speaking terms at that time, and he was not a pleasant guy, I'll say, and I didn't look to him for anything anymore, as young men will sometimes be with their fathers. But when I was released from the hospital, I had not been totally withdrawn from my medications, and it was morphine. And this is kind of like the OxyContin sort of story, 1970s style. I got a little apartment that was being paid for by the county in Ashland, Oregon, which was a sort of a place where a lot of young people and hippies and drug use was prominent. And I started looking around to find if I could find some hard drugs because I was still addicted to morphine. They let me go too early. At that time, I wasn't sure about it. I really felt like I was going to do it, but I hadn't got up my nerve, if you will. But I was essentially jonesing, as they say. And one day I went to the mailbox, and there was a letter from my dad. He had never written me a letter. It was in his neat engineer's script on a piece of graph paper, of course. And my dad was also a Navy veteran of World War II, and that was a big part of his pride. And what he said to me, if I can keep this, it always gives me emotion when I share this, is, he said, "I saw you in that hospital bed as brave as any soldier. And watching you endure what you did in the way that you did makes me very proud of you.
Wow.
And that was kind of it. And that letter probably saved my life. That just him saying that one thing, it was probably the only fatherly thing he'd ever said to me in the 20 years that I'd known him at that time, changed my life in the most powerful way ever.
Tom, this has been such an extraordinary conversation. I can't thank you enough. Beyond not only fascinating, but so much learning and so much wisdom and so much kindness and generosity. So thank you.
Well, and thank you, Frank, for what you're doing, highlighting the good works that people are doing. It's good for the soul, isn't it?
I hope that's the idea. If people want to know more about you, where should they go? Where do you want to point people?
Take them to HatchSpace.org. I am all about that now, and there's plenty of links there if you want to learn the other stuff. And of course, I still have books and things in print, but I'm far less interested in those. Those aren't as good as what I'm doing at HatchSpace. Let's just put it that way. And we'd love. And if anybody's ever in the neighborhood, including you, Frank, I hope you come visit us.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Tom. I encourage you to check him out at HatchSpace.org. We appreciate your listening. If you liked what you've heard, please share Crazy Good Turns with friends. Please also support our show by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting platform of your choice. And connect with us on the social network of your choice. You'll find us at Crazy Good Turns, all one word. As always, I want to thank the team that makes Crazy Good Turns possible, our producers Brian Sabin and Megan Hanlon, editing and mixing by Score, and Leslie Nunn for keeping this operation going forward. Lastly, I want to express my gratitude to you, our listeners, for being part of a community that celebrates people who do great things for others. Your giving of your time to listen to these interviews and acknowledge these good deeds is a crazy good turn of its own. Thank you for your help. And I look forward to connecting again with you soon in our next episode when we celebrate another crazy good turn. Thank you.